Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was an American statesman, author, explorer, soldier, naturalist, and reformer who served as the 26th President of the United States from 1901 to 1909. As a leader of the Republican Party during this time, he became a driving force for the progressive era in the United States in the early 20th century. Born a sickly child with debilitating asthma, Roosevelt successfully overcame his health problems by embracing a strenuous lifestyle. He integrated his exuberant personality, vast range of interests, and world-famous achievements into a cowboy persona defined by robust masculinity. Homeschooled, he began a lifelong naturalist avocation before attending Harvard College. His first of many books, The Naval War of 1812, established his reputation as both a learned historian and as a popular writer. Upon entering politics, he became the leader of the reform faction of Republicans in New York State legislature. Following the deaths of his wife and mother, he took time to grieve by escaping to the wilderness of the American West and operating a cattle ranch in the Dakotas for a time, before returning east to run unsuccessfully for mayor of New York City in 1886. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under William McKinley, resigning after 1 year to serve with the Rough Riders, where he gained national fame for courage during the Spanish-American War. Returning a war hero, he was elected governor of New York in 1898. The state party leadership distrusted him, so they took the lead in moving him to the prestigious but powerless role of vice presidential candidate as McKinley's running mate in the election of 1900. Roosevelt campaigned vigorously across the country, helping McKinley's re-election in a landslide victory based on a platform of peace, prosperity, and conservatism. Following the assassination of President McKinley in September 1901, Roosevelt succeeded to the office at age 42, becoming the youngest American president in history. Leading his party and country into the progressive era, he championed his square deal domestic policies, promising the average citizen fairness, breaking of trusts, regulation of railroads, and pure food and drugs, making conservation a top priority. He established a myriad of new national parks, forests, and monuments intended to preserve the nation's natural resources. In foreign policy, he focused on Central America, where he began construction of the Panama Canal. He greatly expanded the United States Navy and sent the Great White Fleet on a world tour to project the United States naval power around the globe. His successful efforts to end the Russo-Japanese War won him the 1906 Nobel Peace Prize. Elected in 1904 to a full term, Roosevelt continued to promote progressive policies, but many of his efforts and much of his legislative agenda were eventually blocked in Congress. Roosevelt successfully groomed his close friend, William Howard Taft, to succeed him in the presidency. After leaving office, Roosevelt went on safari in Africa and toured Europe. Returning to the United States, he became frustrated with Taft's approach. Failing to win the Republican presidential nomination in 1912, Roosevelt founded his own party, the Progressive, so-called Bull Moose Party, and called for wide-ranging progressive reforms. The split among Republicans enabled the Democrats to win both the White House and a majority in the Congress in 1912. Republicans aligned with Taft nationally would control the Republican Party for decades. Frustrated at home, Roosevelt led a 2-year expedition to the Amazon basin, nearly dying of tropical disease. During World War I, he opposed President Woodrow Wilson for keeping the country out of the war, and offered his military services, which were never accepted. Although planning to run again for president in 1920, Roosevelt suffered deteriorating health and died in early 1919. Roosevelt has consistently been ranked by scholars as one of the greatest American presidents. Historians admire Roosevelt for rooting out corruption in his administration. but are critical of his 1909 libel lawsuits against the World and the News. His face was carved into Mount Rushmore, alongside those of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln. Early life and family. Roosevelt's coat of arms, featuring a rose bush in reference to the name Roosevelt, which is Dutch for Rosefield. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was born on October 27, 1858, at East 20th Street in New York City, New York. Roosevelt's youth was largely shaped by his poor health and debilitating asthma. He repeatedly experienced sudden nighttime asthma attacks that caused the experience of being smothered to death, which terrified both Theodore and his parents. Doctors had no cure. Roosevelt's father significantly influenced him. His father had been a prominent leader in New York's cultural affairs. He helped to found the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and had been especially active in mobilizing support for the Union War effort. Roosevelt wrote, "My father, Theodore Roosevelt, was the best man I ever knew. He combined strength and courage with gentleness, tenderness, and great unselfishness. He would not tolerate in his children selfishness or cruelty, idleness, cowardice, or untruthfulness." Family trips abroad, including tours of Europe in 1869 and 1870, and Egypt in 1872, also had a lasting impact. Roosevelt later articulated the abiding influence of the courageous men he read about, including those in his family. "I was nervous and timid, yet from reading of the people I admired, ranging from the soldiers of Valley Forge and Morgan's riflemen, to the heroes of my favorite stories, and from hearing of the feats of my Southern forefathers and kinsfolk, and from knowing my father, I felt a great admiration for men who were fearless and who could hold their own in the world, and I had a great desire to be like them." Quote, when consoling bereaved people, he would awkwardly invoke unseen and unknown powers. Aside from a few cliches of Protestant rhetoric, the gospel he preached had always been political and pragmatic. He was inspired less by the passion of Christ than by the golden rule, that appealed to reason, amounting, in his mind, to a worldly rather than heavenly law. Education. Roosevelt was mostly homeschooled by tutors and his parents. Biographer H.W. Brands argues that the most obvious drawback to the homeschooling Roosevelt received was uneven coverage of the various areas of human knowledge. After recovering from devastation over his father's sudden death on February 9, 1878, Roosevelt doubled his activities. Roosevelt was an able law student, but he often found law to be irrational. He spent much of his time writing a book on the War of 1812. Determined to enter politics, Roosevelt began attending meetings at Morton Hall, the 59th Street headquarters of New York's 21st District Republican Association. Though Roosevelt's father had been a prominent Republican, the younger Roosevelt made an unorthodox career choice for someone of his class. As most of Roosevelt's peers refrained from becoming too closely involved in politics. Nonetheless, Roosevelt found allies in the local Republican Party, and he defeated an incumbent Republican state assemblyman closely tied to the political machine of Senator Roscoe Conkling. Naval history and strategy. It must be but a poor-spirited American whose veins do not tingle with pride when he reads of the cruises and fights of the sea captains, and their grim prowess, which kept the old Yankee flag floating over the waters of the Atlantic for 3 years, in the teeth of the mightiest naval power the world has ever seen. With the publication of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660, 1783 and 1890, Navy Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan was immediately hailed as the outstanding naval theorist by the leaders of Europe. Roosevelt paid very close attention to Mahan's emphasis that only a nation with the world's most powerful fleet could dominate the world's oceans, exert its diplomacy to the fullest, and defend its own borders. first marriage and widowerhood. On his 22nd birthday, Roosevelt married socialite Alice Hathaway Lee. Their honeymoon was a European tour, particularly energetic for Theodore, who often walked alongside his wife's carriage or horse, as well as a small string of minor peaks. Theodore climbed the Jungfrau and the Matterhorn led by guides. Their daughter, Alice Lee Roosevelt, was born on February 12, 1884. Roosevelt's wife died 2 days after giving birth due to an undiagnosed case of kidney failure, called Bright's disease at the time, which had been masked by the pregnancy. In his diary, Roosevelt wrote a large X on the page and then, "The light has gone out of my life." His mother, Mittie, had died of typhoid fever 11 hours earlier at 3:00 a.m. in the same house. Distraught, Roosevelt left baby Alice in the care of his sister Mamie in New York City while he grieved. He assumed custody of his daughter when she was 3. Roosevelt also reacted by focusing on work, specifically by re-energizing a legislative investigation into corruption of the New York City government, which arose from a concurrent bill proposing that power be centralized in the mayor's office. Early political career. State Assemblyman. Roosevelt was soon put forth as the Republican Party's candidate for the district's House seat in Albany. Presidential election of 1884. With numerous presidential hopefuls to choose from, Roosevelt supported Senator George F. Edmunds of Vermont, a colorless reformer. The state GOP preferred the incumbent president, New York City's Chester Arthur, who was known for passing the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. Arthur, at the time, was suffering from Bright's disease. Unknown to the public, and out of duty, he did not contest his own nomination. Roosevelt fought hard and succeeded in influencing the Manhattan delegates at the state convention in Utica. He then took control of the state convention, bargaining through the night and outmaneuvering the supporters of Arthur and James G. Blaine. He gained a national reputation as a key person in New York State. Roosevelt attended the 1884 GOP National Convention in Chicago and gave a speech convincing delegates to nominate African-American John R. Lynch, an Edmunds supporter, to be temporary chair. Roosevelt fought alongside the Mugwump reformers. However, Blaine, having gained support from Arthur's and Edmunds delegates, won the nomination by 541 votes on the fourth ballot. In a crucial moment of his budding political career, Roosevelt resisted the demand of the Mugwumps that he bolt from Blaine. He bragged about his one small success: "We achieved a victory in getting up a combination to beat the Blaine nominee for temporary chairman. To do this needed a mixture of skill, boldness and energy, to get the different factions to come in, to defeat the common foe." Quote, Cowboy in Dakota. Moving west following the 1884 presidential election, Roosevelt built a second ranch named Elkhorn, 35 miles north of the boomtown of Medora, North Dakota, on the banks of the Little Missouri. Roosevelt learned to ride Western-style, rope and hunt, though he earned the respect of the authentic cowboys. They were not overly impressed. As a deputy sheriff, Roosevelt pursued 3 outlaws who had stolen his boat and escaped north down the Little Missouri. He captured them, but decided against a vigilante hanging. Instead, he sent his foreman back by boat, and conveyed the thieves to Dickinson for trial. He assumed guard over them for 40 hours without sleep, while reading Leo Tolstoy to keep himself awake. When he ran out of his own books, he read a dime store western that one of the thieves was carrying. Roosevelt brought his desire to address the common interests of citizens to the West. He successfully led efforts to organize ranchers to address the problems of overgrazing and other shared concerns. His work resulted in the formation of the Little Missouri Stockmen's Association. He was also compelled to coordinate conservation efforts and was able to form the Boone and Crockett Club, whose primary goal was the conservation of large game animals and their habitats. Second marriage. On December 2, 1886, Roosevelt married his childhood and family friend, Edith Kermit Caro. Re-entering public life. With his ranch failing, Roosevelt returned to New York in 1886. Republican leaders quickly approached him about running for mayor of New York City, and Roosevelt accepted the nomination despite having little hope of winning the race against United Labor Party candidate Henry George and Democratic candidate Abram Hewitt. Civil Service Commission. The very citadel of spoils politics, the hitherto impregnable fortress that had existed unshaken since it was erected on the foundation laid by Andrew Jackson, was tottering to its fall under the assaults of this audacious and irrepressible young man. Whatever may have been the feelings of the fellow Republican Party President Harrison, and there is little doubt that he had no idea when he appointed Roosevelt that he would prove to be so veritable a bull in a china shop, he refused to remove him and stood by him firmly till the end of his term. New York City Police Commissioner. In 1894, a group of reform Republicans approached Roosevelt about running for mayor of New York again. He declined, mostly due to his wife's resistance to being removed from the Washington social set. Soon after he declined, he realized that he had missed an opportunity to reinvigorate a dormant political career. He retreated to the Dakotas for a time. His wife Edith regretted her role in the decision and vowed that there would be no repeat of it. NYC Police Commissioner Roosevelt walks the beat with journalist Jacob Riis in 1894. Illustration from Riis' autobiography. William Lafayette Strong, a reform-minded Republican, won the 1894 mayoral election and offered Roosevelt a position on the board of the New York City Police Commissioners in 1895. When Roosevelt made a habit of walking offices beats late at night and early in the morning to make sure that they were on duty. Emergence as a national figure. Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I would regard war with Spain from two viewpoints. First, the advisability on the grounds both of humanity and self-interest of interfering on behalf of the Cubans, and of taking one more step toward the complete freeing of America from European dominion. Second, the benefit done our people by giving them something to think of which is not material gain, and especially the benefit done our military forces by trying both the Navy and Army in actual practice. On February 15, 1898, the Maine exploded in the harbor of Havana, Cuba, killing hundreds of crew members. While Roosevelt and many other Americans blamed Spain for the explosion, McKinley sought a diplomatic solution. War in Cuba. Prior to his service in the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt had already seen reserve military service from 1882 to 1886 with the New York National Guard, commissioned on August 1, 1882 as a second lieutenant with B Company, 8th Regiment. He was promoted to captain and company commander a year later, and he remained in command until he resigned his commission. When the United States and Spain declared war against each other in late April 1898, Roosevelt resigned from his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and on May 6 formed the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry Regiment along with Army Colonel Leonard Wood. After securing modern multiple-round Krag smokeless carbines, Lieutenant Colonel Roosevelt arrived on May 15. Colonel Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, after capturing Kettle Hill along with members of the 3rd Volunteers and the regular Army Black 10th Cavalry. Under his leadership, the Rough Riders became famous for the charge up Kettle Hill on July 1, 1898. While supporting the regulars, Roosevelt had the only horse, and rode back and forth between rifle pits at the forefront of the advance up Kettle Hill. an advance that he urged despite the absence of any orders from superiors. He was forced to walk up the last part of Kettle Hill, because his horse had been entangled in barbed wire. The victories came at a cost of 200 killed and 1,000 wounded. Roosevelt commented on his role in the battles. On the day of the big fight, I had to ask my men to do a deed that European military writers consider utterly impossible of performance. That is, to attack over open ground and unshaken infantry armed with the best modern repeating rifles behind a formidable system of entrenchments. The only way to get them to do it in the way it had to be done was to lead them myself." Quote. Roosevelt as a veteran. In August, Roosevelt and other officers demanded that the soldiers be returned home. Roosevelt always recalled the Battle of Kettle Hill, part of the San Juan Heights, as the great day of my life, and my crowded hour. In 2001, Roosevelt was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions. He had been nominated during the war, but Army officials, annoyed at his grabbing the headlines, blocked it. Governor of New York. After leaving Cuba in August 1898, the Rough Riders were transported to a camp at Montauk Point, Long Island, where Roosevelt and his men were briefly quarantined due to the War Department's fear of spreading yellow fever. As governor, Roosevelt learned much about ongoing economic issues and political techniques that later proved valuable in his presidency. He was exposed to the problems of trusts, monopolies, labor relations, and conservation. Chessman argues that Roosevelt's program rested firmly upon the concept of the square deal by neutral state. The rules for the square deal were honesty in public affairs, an equitable sharing of privilege and responsibility, and subordination of party and local concerns to the interests of the state at large. By holding twice daily press conferences, which was an innovation, Roosevelt remained connected with his middle-class political base. The New York state government affected many interests, and the power to make appointments to policy-making positions was a key role for the governor. Platt insisted that he be consulted. Roosevelt appeared to comply, but then made his own decisions. Historians marvel that Roosevelt managed to appoint so many first-rate men with Platt's approval. He even enlisted Platt's help in securing reform, such as in the spring of 1899, when Platt pressured state senators to vote for a civil service bill that the secretary of the Civil Service Reform Association called superior to any civil service statute heretofore secured in America. Chessman argues that as governor, Roosevelt developed the principles that shaped his presidency, especially insistence upon the public responsibility of large corporations, publicity as a first remedy for trusts, regulation of railroad rates, mediation of the conflict of capital and labor, conservation of natural resources and protection of the less fortunate members of society. As the chief executive of the most populous state in the Union, Roosevelt was widely considered a potential future presidential candidate, and supporters such as William Allen White encouraged him to run for president. Vice President. In November 1899, Vice President Garrett Hobart died of heart failure. Though Henry Cabot Lodge and others urged him to run for vice president in 1900, Roosevelt was reluctant to take the powerless position and issued a public statement saying that he would not accept the nomination. Roosevelt proved highly energetic and an equal match for Democratic presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan's famous barnstorming style of campaigning. Roosevelt's theme was that McKinley had brought America peace and prosperity and deserved re-election. In a whirlwind campaign, Roosevelt made 480 stops in 23 states. Roosevelt showed the nation his energy, crisscrossing the land denouncing the radicalism of Bryan. In contrast to the heroism of the soldiers and sailors who fought and won the war against Spain, Bryan had strongly supported the war itself. but he denounced the annexation of the Philippines as imperialism, which would spoil America's innocence. Roosevelt countered that it was best for the Filipinos to have stability and the Americans to have a proud place in the world. With the nation basking in peace and prosperity, the voters gave conservative McKinley an even larger landslide than in 1896. The office of vice president was a powerless sinecure and did not suit Roosevelt's aggressive temperament. Presidency. On September 6, President McKinley was attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York when he was shot by an anarchist. Roosevelt was vacationing in Vermont, and traveled to Buffalo to visit McKinley in the hospital. It appeared that McKinley would recover, so Roosevelt resumed his vacation in the Adirondacks. When McKinley's condition worsened, Roosevelt began the trip to Buffalo. McKinley died on September 14, and Roosevelt was informed while he was in North Creek. He continued on to Buffalo and was sworn in at the Ansley Wilcox House. Shortly after taking office, Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington to dinner at the White House. To his dismay, this sparked a bitter, and at times vicious, reaction across the heavily segregated South. Roosevelt reacted with astonishment and protest, saying that he looked forward to many future dinners with Washington. Upon further reflection, Roosevelt wanted to ensure that this had no effect on political support in the South, and further dinner invitations to Washington were avoided. Domestic policies. Trust-busting and regulation. Throughout much of the 1890s, Roosevelt rarely spoke on antitrust policy in his private letters and public speaking. It was not until his election as governor of New York in November 1898 that Roosevelt began to politically sympathize with the public concern over the corporate monopolies created by the super-wealthy. When Roosevelt became president in 1901, he shifted the Republican Party to a more populist direction by increasing antitrust prosecutions. Bolstered by his party's success in the 1902 elections, Roosevelt proposed the creation of the United States Department of Commerce and Labor, which would include the Bureau of Corporations. While Congress was receptive to Department of Commerce and Labor, it was more skeptical of the antitrust powers that Roosevelt sought to endow within the Bureau of Corporations. Coal strike. In May 1902, anthracite coal miners went on strike, threatening a national energy shortage. After threatening the coal operators with intervention by federal troops, Roosevelt won their agreement to an arbitration of the dispute by a commission, which succeeded in stopping the strike, dropping coal prices and retiring furnaces. The accord with J.P. Morgan resulted in the workers getting more pay for fewer hours, but with no union recognition. Prosecuted misconduct. During Roosevelt's second year in office, it was discovered there was corruption in the Indian Service, the Land Office, and the Post Office Department. Roosevelt, who had a high sense of morality and national purpose, investigated and prosecuted corrupt Indian agents who had cheated the Creeks and various tribes out of land parcels. Land fraud and speculation were found involving Oregon federal timberlands. In November 1902, Roosevelt and Secretary Ethan A. Hitchcock forced Binger Hermann, the General Land Office Commissioner, to resign office. On November 6, 1903, Francis J. Henney was appointed special prosecutor, and obtained 146 indictments involving an Oregon Land Office bribery ring. U.S. Senator John H. Mitchell was indicted for bribery to expedite illegal land patents, found guilty in July 1905, and sentenced to 6 months in prison. Railroads. Roosevelt thought it was particularly important for the government to supervise the workings of the railway to avoid corruption in interstate commerce related to the shipment of coal and other commodities and goods. Roosevelt sought to give the Interstate Commerce Commission the power to regulate rates, but the Senate, led by Nelson Aldrich and others with close ties to railroads, opposed Roosevelt's proposal. Pure food and drugs. Roosevelt responded to public anger over the abuses in the food packing industry by pushing Congress to pass the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act, though conservatives initially opposed the bill. Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, published in 1906, helped galvanize support for reform. Business. During the Panic of 1907, nearly all agreed that a more flexible system to ensure liquidity was needed. The Republicans sought a response to the money supply through the bankers, whereas the Democrats sought government control. Roosevelt was unsure, but leaned towards the Republican view while continuing to denounce corporate corruption. Roosevelt was also inclined to extend the regulatory reach of his office. In a moment of frustration, House Speaker Joseph Gurney Cannon commented on Roosevelt's desire for executive branch control in domestic policy-making. "That fellow at the other end of the avenue wants everything from the birth of Christ to the death of the devil." Biographer Brand states, even his friends occasionally wondered whether there wasn't any custom or practice too minor for him to try to regulate, update or otherwise improve. Quote, conservation. Of all Roosevelt's achievements, he was proudest of his work in conservation of natural resources, and ending federal protection to land and wildlife. Executive orders. Roosevelt was the first president to issue over 1,000 executive orders, according to Dr. Graham G. Dodds, a professor of political science at Concordia University. Prior to Roosevelt, only one president had issued over 200 executive orders. Grover Cleveland, the first 25 presidents issued a total of 262 executive orders. Roosevelt issued 1,081. Members of Congress eventually got tired of Roosevelt's excesses in using executive orders to create policy. On February 25, 1907, Senator Charles W. Fulton, a Republican from Oregon, added an amendment to the 1907 Agricultural Appropriations Bill. Foreign policy. In the late 1890s, Roosevelt had been an ardent imperialist, and vigorously defended the permanent acquisition of the Philippines in the 1900 election campaign. After the rebellion ended in 1901, he largely lost interest in the Philippines and Asian expansion in general. Despite the contradictory opinion of his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, as president, he primarily focused the nation's overseas ambitions on the Caribbean, especially locations that had a bearing on the defense of his pet project, the Panama Canal. Following the Spanish-American War, Roosevelt believed that the United States had emerged as a world power, and he sought ways to assert America's newly eminent position abroad. Roosevelt's presidency saw the strengthening of ties with Great Britain. The Great Rapprochement had begun with British support of the United States during the Spanish-American War, and it continued as Britain withdrew its fleet from the Caribbean in favor of focusing on the rising German naval threat. The Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907 resolved unpleasant racial tensions with Japan. Tokyo was angered over the segregation of Japanese children in San Francisco schools. The tensions were ended, but Japan also agreed not to allow unskilled workers to emigrate to the U.S., Latin America and Panama Canal. Roosevelt's attention concerning Latin American turmoil was heightened by his plans for building a canal. In December 1902, the Germans, British, and Italians sought to impose a naval blockade against Venezuela in order to force the repayment of delinquent loans. Roosevelt was particularly concerned with the motives of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm. He succeeded in getting the aggressors to agree to arbitration by a tribunal at The Hague, and averted the Venezuela crisis of 1902-1903. The U.S.'s intentions to influence the area, especially the Panama Canal construction and control, led to the separation of Panama from Colombia in 1903. The pursuit of an isthmus canal in Central America during this period focused on two possible routes, Nicaragua and Panama, which was then a rebellious district within Colombia. Roosevelt convinced Congress to approve the Panamanian alternative, and a treaty was approved, only to be rejected by the Colombian government. When the Panamanians learned of this, a rebellion followed, was supported by Roosevelt, and succeeded. A treaty with the new Panama government for construction of the canal was then reached in 1903. In 1906, following a disputed election, an insurrection ensued in Cuba. Roosevelt sent Taft, the Secretary of War, to monitor the situation. He was convinced that he had the authority to unilaterally authorize Taft to deploy Marines if necessary, without congressional approval. The most striking evolution in the 21st century historiography of Theodore Roosevelt is the switch from a partial arraignment of the imperialist to a quasi-unanimous celebration of the master diplomatist. Media. Building on McKinley's effective use of the press, Roosevelt made the White House the center of news every day, providing interviews and photo opportunities. After noticing the reporters huddled outside the White House in the rain one day, he gave them their own room inside, effectively inventing the presidential press briefing. The grateful press, with unprecedented access to the White House, rewarded Roosevelt with ample coverage. Roosevelt normally enjoyed very close relationships with the press, which he used to keep in daily contact with his middle-class base. While out of office, he made a living as a writer and magazine editor. He loved talking with intellectuals, authors, and writers. He drew the line, however, at expose-oriented scandal-mongering journalists who, during his term, set magazine subscriptions soaring by their attacks on corrupt politicians, mayors, and corporations. Roosevelt himself was not usually a target, but his speech in 1906 coined the term "muckraker" for unscrupulous journalists making wild charges. "The liar," he said, "is no whit better than the thief, and if his mendacity takes the form of slander he may be worse than most thieves." Quote, the press did briefly target Roosevelt in one instance. Ever since 1904, he had been periodically criticized for the manner in which he facilitated the Panama Canal, in the least judicious use of executive power. According to biographer Brands, Roosevelt, near the end of his term, demanded that the Justice Department bring charges of criminal libel against Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. The publication had accused him of deliberate misstatements of fact in defense of family members who were criticized as a result of the Panama affair. Though indictment was obtained, the case was ultimately dismissed in federal court. It was not a federal offense, but one enforceable at the state court level. The Justice Department had predicted that result, and had also advised Roosevelt accordingly. Election of 1904. The control and management of the Republican Party lay in the hands of Ohio Senator and Republican Party Chairman Mark Hanna until McKinley's death. Roosevelt and Hanna frequently cooperated during Roosevelt's first term, but Hanna left open the possibility of a challenge to Roosevelt for the 1904 Republican nomination. Roosevelt and Ohio's other senator, Joseph B. Foraker, forced Hanna's hand by calling for Ohio's state Republican convention to endorse Roosevelt for the 1904 nomination. While Roosevelt followed the tradition of incumbents in not actively campaigning on the stump, he sought to control the campaign's message through specific instructions to Cortelyou. He also attempted to manage the press's release of White House statements by forming the Ananias club. Any journalist who repeated a statement made by the president without approval was penalized by restriction of further access. The Democratic Party's nominee in 1904 was Alton Brooks Parker. Democratic newspapers charged that Republicans were extorting large campaign contributions from corporations, putting ultimate responsibility on Roosevelt himself. A 1912-1913 Senate investigation, led by progressive Minnesota Senator Moses E. Clapp, into the 1904 election showed that Standard Oil had contributed a total of $150,000 to the Republican campaign, and that large corporations had in total contributed $195,000 to the Republican Party. Second-term troubles. As his second term progressed, Roosevelt, moving to the left of his Republican Party base, called for a series of reforms that were mostly not passed. The election of 1904 continued to be a source of contention between Republicans and Democrats. A congressional investigation in 1905 revealed that corporate executives donated tens of thousands of dollars in 1904 to the Republican National Committee. In 1908, a month before the general presidential election, Governor Charles N. Haskell of Oklahoma, former Democratic treasurer, said that senators beholden to Standard Oil lobbied Roosevelt in the summer of 1904 to authorize the leasing of Indian oil lands by Standard Oil subsidiaries. He said Roosevelt overruled his Secretary of Interior Ethan A. Hitchcock and granted a pipeline franchise to run through the Osage lands to the Prairie Oil and Gas Company. The New York Sun made a similar accusation and said that Standard Oil, a refinery who financially benefited from the pipeline, had contributed $150,000 to the Republicans in 1904 after Roosevelt's alleged reversal allowing the pipeline franchise. Roosevelt branded Haskell's allegation as a lie, pure and simple, and obtained a denial from Shaw that Roosevelt had neither coerced Shaw nor overruled him. Post-presidency. Election of 1908. Roosevelt had mixed feelings about a third term, as he enjoyed being president and was still relatively youthful, but felt that a limited number of terms provided a check against dictatorship. Roosevelt ultimately decided to stick to his 1904 pledge not to run for a third term, and Roosevelt decided to throw his support behind a successor so as to avoid a potential pro-Roosevelt delegate stampede at the 1908 Republican National Convention. Roosevelt personally favored Secretary of State Elihu Root, but Root's ill health made him an unsuitable candidate. New York Governor Charles Evans Hughes loomed as potentially strong candidate and shared Roosevelt's progressivism, but Roosevelt disliked him and considered him to be too independent. Instead, Roosevelt settled on his Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, who had ably served under Presidents Harrison, McKinley, and Roosevelt in various positions. Roosevelt and Taft had been friends since 1890, and Taft had consistently supported President Roosevelt's policies. In the 1908 election, Taft easily defeated the Democratic nominee, three-time candidate William Jennings Bryan. Taft promoted a progressivism that stressed the rule of law. He preferred that judges rather than administrators or politicians make the basic decisions about fairness. Taft usually proved to be a less adroit politician than Roosevelt and lacked the energy and personal magnetism, along with the publicity devices, the dedicated supporters, and the broad base of public support that made Roosevelt so formidable. When Roosevelt realized that lowering the tariff would risk creating severe tensions inside the Republican Party by pitting producers, manufacturers and farmers against merchants and consumers, he stopped talking about the issue. Taft ignored the risks and tackled the tariff boldly, encouraging reformers to fight for lower rates. and then cutting deals with conservative leaders that kept overall rates high. The resulting Payne-Aldrich tariff of 1909 was too high for most reformers. But instead of blaming this on Senator Nelson Wilmarth Aldrich and big businesses, Taft took credit, calling it the best tariff ever. He managed to alienate all sides. While the crisis was building inside the party, Roosevelt was touring Africa and Europe to allow Taft to be his own man. Africa and Europe. In March 1909, shortly after the end of his presidency, Roosevelt left New York for the Smithsonian Roosevelt African Expedition, a safari in East and Central Africa outfitted by the Smithsonian Institution. Roosevelt and his companions killed or trapped approximately 11,400. Although the safari was ostensibly conducted in the name of science, it was as much a political and social event as it was a hunting excursion. Roosevelt interacted with renowned professional hunters and land-owning families, and met many native peoples and local leaders. Roosevelt had become a life member of the National Rifle Association in 1907. After arriving in Khartoum in March 1910, Roosevelt toured Europe, stopping first in Egypt. He commented favorably on British rule of the region, giving his opinion that Egypt was not yet ready for independence. Roosevelt held similar views about the Philippines. Election of 1912. The Progressive Bull Moose Party. Excerpts from a speech given by Theodore Roosevelt at Carnegie Hall, March 12, 1912, recorded August 1912 by Thomas Edison. Duration 4:07. Once his defeat as the GOP nominee was probable, Roosevelt announced that he would accept the progressive nomination on a progressive platform and, "I shall fight to the end, win or lose." At the same time, Roosevelt prophetically said, "My feeling is that the Democrats will probably win if they nominate a progressive." At the 1912 Progressive National Convention, Roosevelt cried out, "We stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord." California Governor Hiram Johnson was nominated as Roosevelt's running mate. Roosevelt's platform echoed his 1907 8 proposals, calling for vigorous government intervention to protect the people from the selfish interests, to destroy this invisible government, to dissolve the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics is the first task of the statesmanship of the day. Many Progressive Party supporters in the North were supporters of civil rights for blacks. Roosevelt did not want to alienate them. On the other hand, his chief advisors in the South insisted the Progressive Party had to be a white man's party there. Rival all-white and all-black delegations from 4 southern states arrived at the Progressive National Convention. Roosevelt decided to seat the all-white delegations. He ran a "Lily White" campaign in the South in 1912. Assassination attempt. On October 14, 1912, while campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Roosevelt was shot by a saloonkeeper named John Fleming Shrink. The bullet lodged in his chest after penetrating his steel eyeglass case and passing through a thick single-folded copy of the speech titled "Progressive Cause Greater Than Any Individual," which he was carrying in his jacket. Because of the bullet wound, Roosevelt was taken off the campaign trail in the final weeks of the race, which ended on Election Day, November 5. Though the other 2 campaigners stopped their own campaigns during the week Roosevelt was in the hospital, they resumed it once he was released. The bullet lodged in his chest exacerbated his rheumatoid arthritis and prevented him from doing his daily stint of exercises. Roosevelt soon became obese. Election results. After the Democrats nominated Governor Woodrow Wilson of New Jersey, Roosevelt did not expect to win the general election, as Wilson had compiled a record attractive to many progressive Democrats who might have otherwise considered voting for Roosevelt. Roosevelt won 4.1 million votes, compared to Taft's 3. 5 million. Wilson gained 6.3 million votes, enough for a massive landslide in the Electoral College, with 435 electoral votes. Roosevelt won 88 electoral votes, and Taft had 8. Pennsylvania was the only eastern state won by Roosevelt. In the Midwest, he carried Michigan, Minnesota, and South Dakota. In the West, California, and Washington. The South, as usual, was solidly Democratic. 1913 1914 South American expedition. A friend of Roosevelt's, Father John Augustine Sam, a Catholic priest and scientist at the University of Notre Dame, had searched for new adventures and found them in the forests of South America. After a briefing of several of his own expeditions, he persuaded Roosevelt to participate in such an expedition in 1912. To finance the expedition, Roosevelt received support from the American Museum of Natural History, promising to bring back many new animal specimens. Roosevelt's popular book, Through the Brazilian Wilderness, describes his expedition into the Brazilian jungle in 1913 as a member of the Roosevelt-Rondon scientific expedition, co-named after its leader, Brazilian explorer Candido Rondon. The book describes the scientific discovery, scenic tropical vistas, and exotic flora and fauna experienced during the adventure. From left to right, seated, Fr. John Augustine Sam, Candido Rondon, Kermit Roosevelt, Cherry Miller. 4 Brazilians: Roosevelt, Fiala, only Roosevelt, Kermit, Cherry, Rondon, and the Brazilians traveled down the River of Doubt. Once in South America, a new, far more ambitious goal was added: to find the headwaters of the Rio da Duvida, the River of Doubt, and trace it north to the Madeira and thence to the Amazon River. It was later renamed Roosevelt River in honor of the former president. Roosevelt's crew consisted of his son Kermit, naturalist Colonel Rondon, George K. Cherry, sent by the American Museum of Natural History, Brazilian Lieutenant João Lira, team physician Dr. José Antonio Cajazera, and 16 skilled paddlers and porters, called camaradas. During the trip down the river, Roosevelt suffered a minor leg wound after he jumped into the river to try to prevent 2 canoes from smashing against the rocks. The flesh wound he received, however, soon gave him tropical fever that resembled the malaria he had contracted while in Cuba 15 years before. Despite Roosevelt's continued decline and loss of over 50 pounds, Commander Rondon reduced the pace of the expedition to allow for his commission's map-making and other geographical tasks, which required regular stops to fix the expedition's position by sun-based survey. Upon Roosevelt's return to New York, friends and family were startled by his physical appearance and fatigue. Roosevelt wrote, perhaps prophetically, to a friend that the trip had cut his life short by 10 years. For the rest of his few remaining years, he would be plagued by flare-ups of malaria and leg inflammation so severe as to require surgery. Final years. Roosevelt returned to the United States in May 1914. Roosevelt was outraged by the Wilson administration's conclusion of a treaty that expressed sincere regret for the way in which the United States had acquired the Panama Canal Zone, but was impressed by many of the reforms passed under Wilson. Progressives asked Roosevelt to run for governor of New York in 1914, but he had no interest in another gubernatorial term and was still recovering from malaria. When World War I began in 1914, Roosevelt strongly supported the Allies and demanded a harsher policy against Germany, especially regarding submarine warfare. Roosevelt angrily denounced the foreign policy of President Wilson, calling it a failure regarding the atrocities in Belgium and the violations of American rights. Roosevelt's attacks on Wilson helped the Republicans win control of Congress in the off-year elections of 1918. He declined a request from New York Republican to run for another gubernatorial term, but attacked Wilson's 14 points, calling instead for the unconditional surrender of Germany. He was cautiously optimistic about the proposed League of Nations, but had reservations about its impact on United States sovereignty. Death. On the night of January 5, 1919, Roosevelt suffered breathing problems. He felt better after treatment from his physician, Dr. George W. Fowler, and went to bed. Roosevelt's last words were, "Please put out that light, James," to his family servant James Amos. Between 4:00 and 4:15 the next morning, Roosevelt died in his sleep at Sagamore Hill. A blood clot had detached from a vein and traveled to his lungs. Political positions and speeches. Theodore Roosevelt introduced the phrase "square deal" to describe his progressive views in a speech delivered after leaving the office of the presidency in August 1910. In his broad outline, he stressed equality of opportunity for all citizens and emphasized the importance of fair government regulations of corporate special interests. Roosevelt was one of the first presidents to make conservation a national issue. In his speech at Osawatomie, Kansas, on August 31, 1910, he outlined his views on conservation of the lands of the United States. He favored using America's natural resources, but opposed wasteful consumption. Positions on immigration, minorities, civil rights, and eugenics. Immigration. In an 1894 article on immigration, Roosevelt said, "We must Americanize in every way, in speech, in political ideas and principles, and in their way of looking at relations between church and state. We welcome the German and the Irishman who becomes an American. We have no use for the German or Irishman who remains such. He must revere only our flag. Not only must it come first, but no other flag should even come second." Quote, "It is unwise to depart from the old American tradition and discriminate for or against any man who desires to come here and become a citizen, save on the ground of that man's fitness for citizenship. We cannot afford to consider whether he is Catholic or Protestant, Jew or Gentile, whether he is Englishman or Irishman, Frenchman or German, Japanese, Italian, or Scandinavian or Magyar. What we should desire to find out is the individual quality of the individual man." Minorities and civil rights. Indian chiefs headed by Geronimo in review before Roosevelt on Inauguration Day in Washington, D.C., March 4, 1905. He was the first president to appoint a Jewish cabinet member. Secretary of Commerce and Labor, Oscar Solomon Strauss, who served from 1906 to 1909. Strauss, who had helped co-found the Immigration Protective League in 1898, was the Roosevelt administration's cabinet official overseeing immigration. He helped secure the passage and implementation of the Immigration Act of 1907. I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are. And I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. The most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian. Turn 300 low families of New York into New Jersey. Support them for 50 years in vicious idleness, and you will have some idea of what the Indians are. Reckless, revengeful, fiendishly cruel. They rob and murder, not the cowboys, who can take care of themselves, but the defenseless, lone settlers on the plains. I have not been able to think out any solution of the terrible problem offered by the presence of the Negro on this continent. But of one thing I am sure, and that is that inasmuch as he is here and can neither be killed nor driven away, the only wise and honorable and Christian thing to do is to treat each black man and each white man strictly on his merits as a man, giving him no more and no less than he shows himself worthy to have. Roosevelt appointed numerous African Americans to federal offices, such as Walter L. Cohen of New Orleans, a leader of the Black and Tan Republican faction, whom Roosevelt named Register of the Federal Land Office. Contrasting the European conquest of North America with that of Australia, Roosevelt wrote, "The natives of Australia were so few in number and of such a low type, that they practically offered no resistance at all, being but little more hindrance than an equal number of ferocious beasts." Race suicide and eugenics. Roosevelt was intensely active in warning against race suicide, and held a neo-Lamarckist viewpoint. In 1914, he said, "I wish very much that the wrong people could be prevented entirely from breeding. And when the evil nature of these people is sufficiently flagrant, this should be done. Criminals should be sterilized and feeble-minded persons forbidden to leave offspring behind them." Quote, "The book is a capital book. In purpose, in vision, in grasp of the facts our people most need to realize. It shows an extraordinary range of reading and a wide scholarship. It shows a habit of singular serious thought on the subject of most commanding importance. It shows a fine fearlessness in assailing the popular and mischievous sentimentalities and attractive and corroding falsehoods which few men dare assail. It is the work of an American scholar and gentleman, and all Americans should be sincerely grateful to you for writing it." He insisted to. Writer. Roosevelt was a prolific author, writing with passion on subjects ranging from foreign policy to the importance of the national park system. Roosevelt was also an avid reader of poetry. Poet Robert Frost said that Roosevelt was our kind. He quoted poetry to me. He knew poetry. Quote, "As an editor of Outlook magazine, Roosevelt had weekly access to a large, educated national audience. In all, Roosevelt wrote about 18 books, each in several editions, including his autobiography. Roosevelt also published an account of his 1909-10 African expedition entitled African Game Trails. In 1907, Roosevelt became embroiled in a widely publicized literary debate known as the Nature Fakers controversy. A few years earlier, naturalist John Burroughs had published an article entitled "Real and Sham Natural History" in the Atlantic Monthly, attacking popular writers of the day such as Ernest Thompson Seton, Charles G. D. Roberts, and William J. Long for their fantastical representations of wildlife. Roosevelt agreed with Burroughs' criticisms, and published several essays of his own denouncing the booming genre of naturalistic animal stories as "yellow journalism of the woods." It was the president himself who popularized the negative term "nature faker" to describe writers who depicted their animal characters with excessive anthropomorphism. Character and beliefs. Roosevelt intensely disliked being called Teddy, and was quick to point out this fact to those who referred to him as such, though it would become widely used by newspapers during his political career. He attended church regularly. In 1907, concerning the motto, "In God We Trust," on money, he wrote, "It seems to me eminently unwise to cheapen such a motto by use on coins, just as it would be to cheapen it by use on postage stamps, or in advertisements." Quote, he was also a member of the Freemasons and Sons of the American Revolution. Roosevelt had a lifelong interest in pursuing what he called, in an 1899 speech, the strenuous life. To this end, he exercised regularly and took up boxing, tennis, hiking, rowing, polo, and horseback riding. As governor of New York, he boxed with sparring partners several times each week, a practice he regularly continued as president until being hit so hard in the face he became blind in his left eye, a fact not made public until many years later. Thereafter, he practiced judo, attaining a third-degree brown belt. He also continued his habit of skinny dipping in the Potomac River during the winter. Roosevelt was an enthusiastic single-stick player and, according to Harper's Weekly, showed up at a White House reception with his arm bandaged after a bout with General Leonard Wood in 1905. Legacy. Historians credit Roosevelt for changing the nation's political system by permanently placing the presidency at center stage and making character as important as the issues. His notable accomplishments include trust-busting and conservatism. He is a hero to liberals for his proposals in 1907, 12 that presaged the modern welfare state of the New Deal era, and put the environment on the national agenda. Conservatives admire his big stick, diplomacy and commitment to military values. Dalton says, "Today he is heralded as the architect of the modern presidency, as a world leader who boldly reshaped the office to meet the needs of the new century and redefined America's place in the world." Quote, however, liberals have criticized him for his interventionist and imperialist approach to nations he considered uncivilized. Conservatives reject his vision of the welfare state and emphasis on the superiority of government over private action. Historians typically rank Roosevelt among the top 5 presidents. Persona and masculinity. Roosevelt, more than any other man, showed the singular primitive quality that belongs to ultimate matter, the quality that medieval theology assigned to God. He was pure act. Recent biographers have stressed Roosevelt's personality. Cooper compared him with Woodrow Wilson, and discovered that both of them played the roles of warrior and priest. What makes the hero a hero is the romantic notion that he stands above the tawdry give and take of everyday politics, occupying an ethereal realm where partisanship gives way to patriotism, and division to unity, and where the nation regains its lost innocence, and the people their shared sense of purpose. Memorials. Roosevelt was included with Presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Abraham Lincoln at the Mount Rushmore Memorial, designed in 1927 with the approval of Republican President Calvin Coolidge. In 2008, Columbia Law School awarded a law degree to Roosevelt, posthumously making him a member of the class of 1882. Theodore Roosevelt Association. In 1919, the Theodore Roosevelt Association, originally known as the Permanent Memorial National Committee, was founded by friends and supporters of Roosevelt, soon renamed the Roosevelt Memorial Association, RMA. It was chartered in 1920 under Title 36 of the United States Code. In parallel with the RMA was an organization for women, the Women's Theodore Roosevelt Association, that had been founded in 1919 by an act of the New York State Assembly. Both organizations merged in 1956 under the current name. This organization preserved Roosevelt's papers in a 20-year project, preserved his photos and established 4 public sites. The reconstructed Theodore Roosevelt Birthplace National Historic Site, New York City, dedicated in 1923 and donated to the National Park Service in 1963. Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Park, Oyster Bay, Long Island, New York, dedicated in 1928 and given to the people of Oyster Bay. Theodore Roosevelt Island in the Potomac River in Washington, D.C., given to the federal government in 1932. Sagamore Hill House, Roosevelt's Oyster Bay home, opened to the public in 1953 and was donated to the National Park Service in 1963 and is now the Sagamore Hill National Historic Site. Other locations named for Roosevelt include Theodore Roosevelt National Park in North Dakota, and Theodore Roosevelt Lake and Theodore Roosevelt Dam in Arizona. Another attempt at a presidential library. Dickinson State University in western North Dakota is attempting to create a presidential library. In 2013, the North Dakota legislature appropriated $12 million to build an actual complex similar to the Official libraries run by the National Archives. In popular culture, TR impersonator Joe Wiegand performs October 27, 2008 in the East Room of the White House, during a celebration of Roosevelt's 150th birthday. Roosevelt's "speak softly and carry a big stick" ideology is still quoted by politicians and columnists in different countries, not only in English, but also in translations to various other languages. One lasting, popular legacy of Roosevelt is the stuffed toy bears, teddy bears, named after him following an incident on a hunting trip in Mississippi in 1902. Roosevelt famously refused to shoot a defenseless black bear that had been tied to a tree. In 1905, Roosevelt, an admirer of various Western figures, named Captain Bill McDonald of the Texas Rangers as his bodyguard and entertained the legendary Texan at the White House. Ironically, in the 1912 campaign, McDonald was Woodrow Wilson's bodyguard. Wilson thereafter named the Democrat McDonald as the U.S. Marshal for the Northern District of Texas. Roosevelt has been portrayed many times in film and on television. Carl Swenson played him in the 1967 Western picture Brighty of the Grand Canyon, the story of a real-life burro who guided Roosevelt on a hunting trip to find mountain lions. Robin Williams portrayed Roosevelt in the form of a wax mannequin that comes to life in Night at the Museum and its sequels Night at the Museum, Battle of the Smithsonian, and Night at the Museum, Secret of the Tomb. In Don Rosa's comic book series The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, Roosevelt meets and befriends Scrooge McDuck in 1882 when both were visiting the Dakota Badlands, and later again in 1902 at Fort Duckburg. In Don Rosa's story The Sharpie of the Culebra Cut, collected in The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck Companion, they meet for the third time during the construction of the Panama Canal in 1906. Media. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the first presidents whose voice was recorded for posterity. Several of his recorded speeches survive. Of the Progressive Party in 1912, wherein he proclaims it the party of the people, in contrast with the other major parties. Full biographies. Brands. Henry William, Tr. The Last Romantic. Full biography. New York. Basic Books. ISBN 978-0465-069583. OCLC 36954615. Cooper, John Milton. The Warrior and the Priest. Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt. Dual scholarly biography. ISBN 978-0-674-94751-1. Dalton, Kathleen. Theodore Roosevelt, A Strenuous Life. Full scholarly biography. ISBN 0-679-76733-9. Harbaugh, William Henry. The Life and Times of Theodore Roosevelt. PDF. Full scholarly biography. Putnam, Carlton. Theodore Roosevelt. Biography. I. The Formative Years. Only volume published. To age 28. Personality and activities. Bishop, Joseph Buckland. Theodore Roosevelt's letters to his children. Wildside Press. ISBN 978-1-434-48394-2. De Silvestro, Roger. Theodore Roosevelt in the Badlands. A Young Politician's Quest in the American West. Walker & Co. ISBN 978-0-8027-1721-4. Fenn, Bruce. Theodore Roosevelt and American Masculinity. Magazine of History. 1952. 59. doi. 10. 1093, Magist 19. 2. 52. ISSN 0882-228X provides a lesson plan on TR as the historical figure who most exemplifies the quality of masculinity. Gluck, Sherwin. TR's Summer White House. Oyster Bay. chronicles the events of TR's presidency during the summers of his 2 terms. Greenberg, David. Beyond the Bully Pulpit. Wilson Quarterly. 35, 22, 29. The President's Use of Publicity, Rhetoric and Force of Personality. Millard, Candace. River of Doubt. Theodore Roosevelt's Darkest Journey. His deadly 1913-14 trip to the Amazon. McCullough, David. Mornings on Horseback. The Story of an Extraordinary Family. The Vanished Way of Life and the Unique Child Who Became Theodore Roosevelt. Simon & Schuster. Bestseller. To 1886. Mornings on Horseback. The Story of an Extraordinary Family. The Vanished Way of Life. And the Unique Child Who Became Theodore Roosevelt. Popular Biography. To 1884. O'Toole, Patricia. When Trumpets Call. Theodore Roosevelt After the White House. Simon & Schuster. ISBN 0-684-86477-0. 494 pp. Renahan, Edward J. The Lion's Pride. Theodore Roosevelt and His Family in Peace and War. Oxford University Press. Examines TR and his family during the World War I period. Testi, Arnaldo. The Gender of Reform Politics. Theodore Roosevelt and the Culture of Masculinity. Journal of American History. 81, 1509. 33, doi, 10, 2307, 2,081,647. Thompson, J. Lee. Theodore Roosevelt Abroad, Nature, Empire, and the Journey of an American President. Palgrave Macmillan. ISBN 978-0230-10277-4. 240 pp. TR in Africa and Europe. 1909. 10. Watts, Sarah. Rough Rider in the White House. Theodore Roosevelt and the Politics of Desire. 289 pp. Yarbrough, Jean M. Theodore Roosevelt and the American Political Tradition. University Press of Kansas. 337 pp. TR's Political Thought and Its Significance for Republican Self-Government. Domestic Policies. Brinkley, Douglas. The Wilderness Warrior. Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America. New York, HarperCollins. Online Review. Another Online Review. Dorsey, Leroy G. The Frontier Myth and Teddy Roosevelt's Fight for Conservation. In Gerster, Patrick. Cords, Nicholas. Myth America, A Historical Anthology. 2. St. James, N.Y. Brandywine Press. ISBN 1-88108997-5. Gould, Louis L. The Presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Standard History of His Domestic and Foreign Policy as President. Bukhari, Muhammad L. Kamel. Mapping the anthropocentric-ecocentric dualism in the History of American Presidency. The Good, the Bad, and the Ambivalent. Journal of Studies in Social Sciences 14. No. 2. Murphy, William. Theodore Roosevelt and the Bureau of Corporation. Executive Corporate Cooperation and the Advancement of the Regulatory State. American 19th Century History. 14. 73. 111. doi. 10. 1080 14,664,658. 2013. 774,983. Redekop, Benjamin. Embodying the Story. The Conservation Leadership of Theodore Roosevelt. Leadership doi. 10. 1177 1,742,714,546,875 online. Swanson, Ryan A. I Never Was a Champion at Anything. Theodore Roosevelt's Complex and Contradictory Record as America's Sports President. Journal of Sport History. 38. 425. 46. Politics. Loom, John Morton. The Republican Roosevelt. Cambridge, Harvard University Press. OCLC 310975. How TR Did Politics. Chase, James. 1912. Wilson, Roosevelt, Taft, and Debs. The Election That Changed the Country. ISBN 978-07-432-03944. 323 pp. Chambers, John W. Woodward, C. Van, ed. Responses of the Presidents to Charges of Misconduct. New York, New York, Delacorte Press. pp. 207, 237. ISBN 0-440-05923-2. Gould, Louis L. Four Hats in the Ring. The 1912 Election and the Birth of Modern American Politics. By a Leading Scholar. Haverkamp, Michael. Roosevelt and Taft. How the Republican Vote Split in Ohio in 1912. Ohio History. 110, 121, 35. Cohn, Edward P. Spring 2006. A Necessary Defeat. Theodore Roosevelt and the New York mayoral election of 1886. New York History. 87, 205, 27. Crossing the Rubicon. Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and the 1884 Republican National Convention. Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. 5, 18, 45, doi, 10, 1017 per seconds 1,537,781,400,000,000 2851. Milkus, Sidney M. Theodore Roosevelt, The Progressive Party, and the Transformation of American Democracy. Lawrence, University Press of Kansas. 361 pp. Murray, George E. Theodore Roosevelt and the Election of 1910. The Mississippi Valley Historical Review. 25, 523, 34, doi, 10, 2307 1,892,499. JSTOR 1,892,499. The Era of Theodore Roosevelt and the Birth of Modern America. 1900, 1912. General Survey of Era. Powell, Jim. Bully Boy. The Truth About Theodore Roosevelt's Legacy. Crown Forum. ISBN 0-307-23722-2. Attacks TR Policies from Conservative Libertarian Perspective. Ruddy, Daniel. Theodore the Great. Conservative Crusader. Washington, D.C. Regnery History. ISBN 978-1-62157-441-5. Foreign and Military Policies. Beale, Howard K. Theodore Roosevelt and the Rise of America to World Power. Standard History of His Foreign Policy. Hendricks, Henry J. Theodore Roosevelt's Naval Diplomacy, the U.S. Navy and the Birth of the American Century. Holmes, James R. Theodore Roosevelt and World Order. Police Power in International Relations. 328 pp. Jones, Greg. Honor in the Dust. Theodore Roosevelt, War in the Philippines, and the Rise and Fall of America's Imperial Dream. Oyos, Matthew. Courage, Careers, and Comrades. Theodore Roosevelt and the United States Army Officer Corps. Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. 10, 23, 58, doi, 10, 1017 per seconds 1,537,781,410,022. On TR's Controversial Reforms. Rickard, Serge. The Roosevelt Corollary. Presidential Studies Quarterly. 36, 17, 26, doi, 10, 1111, J. 1741 to 5705. 2006, 002A3. X. Theodore Roosevelt, Imperialist or Global Strategist in the New Expansionist Age. Quote, Diplomacy and Statecraft. 19, 639. 57. doi 10.10809592290802564379. Rofe, J. Simon. Under the Influence of Mayan. Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt and Their Understanding of American National Interest, Diplomacy and Statecraft. 19. 732. 45. doi 10.10809592290802564536. Thompson, John M. Internationalists and Isolationist Times? Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt and a Rooseveltian Maxim. Journal of Transatlantic Studies. 9. 46. 62. doi 10.1080 14,794,012. 2011. 550,773. Tilchin, William N. Noy, Charles E. eds. Artists of Power. Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and Their Enduring Impact on U.S. Foreign Policy. Prager, 196 pp. Official organizations, libraries and collections. Julian L. Street Papers on Theodore Roosevelt, at the Seeley G. Mudd Manuscript Library, Princeton University. Dorsey, and Lawrence H. Budnor Collection on Theodore Roosevelt at the DeGolyer Library, Southern Methodist University. Media. Life Portrait of Theodore Roosevelt, from CSPAN's American Presidents. Life Portraits, September 3, 1999. Other.